Okay, let's get started. We have an all-star panel now in this second session to explore to what extent SDGs represent or rely on factors that, although not completely new, might anyway push global governance in perhaps new directions. Yes, goal setting or expertise or the governance of governance, meta governance, right? Tools that, broadly speaking, do not depend on the transfer of authority to international institutions. And to do that, we have three panelists that are among the people that have published stuff that you need to read if you want to know stuff on sustainable development goals. It's a few of the people that have made big contributions to the field. We have Frank Biermann, who is a professor of global sustainable governance at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at the Utrecht University. We have, I will be mispronouncing a lot today, so I hope you can all forgive me. We'll have also Anne Ellersiek, who is member of the Science Platform Sustainability 2030, which is the German expert body on the Sustainable Development Strategy approved in 2016. And a senior research associate at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. And before that, she was affiliated at the SBP too. And then we have Louisa Moyleman, who is a vice chair of the United Nations Committee on Experts on Public Administration. But he is also a member of the Scientific Committee of the European Environmental Agency, a visiting professor at Leuven, among many other affiliations. So as I said before, we do have an all-star panel here on the issue of SDGs, and I am very much eager to get the ball rolling. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. We will try and talk within the limits of 10 to 13 minutes, if that is possible, so that we can open then reactions / Q&A section, so that the attendees and panelists themselves can talk to each other and push each other on a number of different issues. Okay, so by alphabetical order, let's start with Dr. Frank Biermann. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure being here in this panel and discussing an issue as important as the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm a political scientist, and I talk a little bit about the relationship of the Sustainable Development Goals and global governance to the extent. So I want to know to what extent the Sustainable Development Goals have any steering effects as a new mechanism in global governance and international relations. This is the topic of my talk. And the problem with these online seminars, of course, is that you never really know 100% who the audience is. So I just have 2 slides to introduce the Sustainable Development Goals for those of you who might not be familiar with this new instrument from the United Nations. So the core idea is that the United Nations General Assembly has agreed in 2015 on 17 goals. They're called the Sustainable Development Goals. Sometimes they're also called the Global Goals. And they cover essentially all aspects and all dimensions of human activities, starting, you see it here on the slide, from number 1, no poverty, no hunger, good health, and then you can run through them all to coming to number 13, climate, life below water, life on land, and peace and justice. So these are the 17 new goals that the United Nations has agreed upon, and the goal is that all of these 17 goals should be achieved by 2030. The language that you find in these goals and also in the United Nations Declaration around them is extremely impressive, it's extremely ambitious. So you find all kind of extremely new and ambitious terminology. For example, on the right corner, that now governments are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want, and to heal and secure our planet. And tremendous language has been developed. The question is, of course, to what extent these goals are actually being implemented, and to what extent this language and these ambitions that you find in these goals really have an impact on the behavior of countries, of civil society, of industry, international organizations, etc. Because the point is, if you look at these goals as a new approach in governance, maybe they are, number one, not legally binding. So no country will ever be held accountable by not implementing these goals. They have 169 targets, to make them more precise, but many of these targets are very qualitative. So they're very difficult to assess and to see how progress is actually being made on these goals and their targets. The goals are meant to be integrative. There were some goals earlier, the Millennium Development Goals, which were essentially targeting developing countries. Now the goals are meant to be implemented by all countries, including by Spain, but by all other countries as well. And as I mentioned already, they are supposed to encompass almost all activities that humans can ever do, all political activities. So the big question is, if you look at these goals from the United Nations General Assembly that are so ambitious but not legally binding and largely qualitative, will this new approach of the United Nations actually work? Will it work to have these goals and then expect that by 2030, many of their ambitions will be achieved? And this is a big question, I think, for the sustainability research and sustainability science community. And to study this, we have set up at Utrecht University a research program, which we call the Global Goals Research Program. It's a team of about 12 researchers looking at these issues in a 5-year research effort funded by the European Research Council, where we are looking at the steering effects that the Sustainable Development Goals had so far. So we are looking at the period 2015 till 2020, or also 2021, but we also want to be forward-looking and try to make predictions about the future effectiveness in the next decade for these goals. We are doing academic research, so we are all social scientists. We're looking at from a social science, political science, institutionalist perspective, but we're also very much engaged with public policy and also with global activists in this field. And we're looking at the SDGs in particular, but we also have a much broader perspective and try to advance the theory of global governance by looking at these goals, by looking at the SDGs and trying to understand their impacts that they had so far. We have a variety of methods. We do network analysis, we are mining the internet, we're looking at all kinds of surveys that we are conducting ourselves, we're doing textual analysis, discourse analysis, all kinds of other social science methods. We are doing in order to answer essentially 5 main questions. And I run through the questions quickly, and then I come to some of our preliminary results. Because just to warn you, the results are preliminary. We have started just 1.5 years ago, and we are still working on it. So our publications are still in the pipeline, and I cannot share the final results of this project by far. So one of the key questions we have, and I think many of us in the audience, many of you in the audience will have the same question: what are actually the effects of these SDGs that we can observe today, right now, in global governance, in the United Nations system, but also in national political systems? Has anything changed in Spain, for example, or in Barcelona because of the SDGs, because the SDGs have been agreed upon by the United Nations General Assembly? Can we see some variations in the impact between industrialized countries, developing countries, and least developed countries? Are they maybe more impactful in some countries than in others? What are the impacts outside the national government system at a subnational level, in provinces, in regions, in cities such as Barcelona? Is there anything that the city government of Barcelona has changed in the last 5 years because of the SDGs? What are the impacts on companies and businesses? We had discussed this in the earlier panel, but also the impacts on civil society, universities, communities, etc. So this is one of our key questions. Can we identify change in the behavior of political actors at these levels because of the SDGs? And the second question that we are very interested in is the challenge of integration interlinkages. The core idea of the SDGs is that they are aligning governmental and other actors' activities around the agenda so that governments and other actors are not just picking 1 or 2 of the targets or 1 or 2 of the SDGs, but that actors are implementing this all together. So the idea is that the SDGs, the entire agenda, is an integrated and coherent whole. It has to be implemented like that. So we are analyzing this. We want to know to what extent are actors really align their activities because of the SDGs. To what extent so is any alignment happening, and to what extent is this attributable to the goals that were adopted in 2015. And then the third question that is very dear to my heart is part of the SDG agenda, is the idea of inclusiveness, or as it has been coined in these new United Nations documents, no one will be left behind. And this is a claim. So if you go to the high-level political forum, you always find in all these declarations that Marianne has already pointed out in the earlier sessions, the claim that governments and other actors are committed that no one will be left behind in implementing this ambitious agenda. So we want to know, is it really happening? Is it really happening that no one is left behind? What is the impact that the SDGs have on the poorest, on the most vulnerable people? And how is it really happening that in this entire process, the eradication of poverty is really advancing? So this is one thing that we are looking at in our research, to see to what extent we really find an increasing inclusiveness in global governance because of the SDGs. This is our third question that we are looking at. And then the fourth question has been very much also discussed in the run-up to the SDGs when they were negotiated, is the tension between economic and social policies and the protection of the environment. And what is more important? There has been this wedding cake model that you see here from our colleagues in Stockholm, which suggests in a way a hierarchization, that some goals are maybe more fundamental, the protection of the biosphere, others are more society, economic, coming back later. So, but the key question that we are answering is, to what extent have the SDGs really helped to advance also the protection of planetary integrity and ecological integrity in countries, but also at the planetary scale? To what extent have the SDGs helped to make trade, economic policy, energy policies, settlements, and other concerns of economic and social policy be more sustainable in a way of ecological integrity? This is one of the questions that we are also analyzing in our research program. And whoops, that was one too many. Sorry. No, it was okay. Good. So these are kind of the core questions we had. And now I come back to some of the methodological pitfalls that we have, but also to some of the findings that we have so far. And number one, and this is very much typical for political science research in this field, and those of you who are from the political sciences will surely recognize this, is a problem of causality. So suppose we find any progress towards SDG achievement, that we have less hunger maybe, or better climate protection, or better biodiversity protection, or we have more decent work, or less equality. Suppose we find in a country or in any city or in the national nations, do we find any improvement? We have to show that this is because of the SDGs. Is it not just a random correlation, or is it an effect that the SDGs have really been brought upon? And this is very difficult methodologically. And this is one thing that we are starting with, and I can talk about this later also in the day. The other point is related to that, is the question of past dependency. Sometimes you find change from 2015 to 2020. So some indicators are improving. And there are lots of international organizations and websites and services that provide you with information on whether any achievement has been done on the SDGs towards 2030. So you find trends that might be positive. The point is, quite often these trends have started much earlier. You find a linear development of improvement, but you don't find a spike in 2015. So it's quite likely that some trends are just positive by themselves. Policies are improving to some extent, but not necessarily because in 2015, the United Nations General Assembly has agreed on 17 global goals. Thirdly, the point is that many organizations are using the SDGs, and we had this a bit in the previous panel. The question is, to what extent does it really signal behavior change? Websites, glossy brochures, they're all full with references to the SDG. Everybody talks about the SDGs. Any CEO of any international corporation will talk about SDGs. To what extent does this really signal behavior change? And this is one of the key questions that we have in our program. The fifth point is what we call bi-directionality. And this is interesting because the SDGs didn't fall out of the sky. They have been negotiated by governments, with the involvement of international organizations in the entire United Nations bureaucracy, and also to some extent civil society. It was a multi-stakeholder process, and in the end it was the government and United Nations General Assembly that took the decision. So many important actors have shaped the SDGs. And then the point is, to some extent, they're now implementing the SDGs, but this is not a steering effect. This is just because actors have shaped the SDGs in the beginning, and therefore they seem to be implementing them, but they're just doing what they would have done anyway. So it's not an effect of a global goal, it's just what we call bi-directionality, that actors shape the SDGs and then also seem to implement them without really being affected by goals. And the last point here is what we call preaching to the converted. You find communities, especially if you look at environmental ministries or NGOs, where the discourse changes. People who used to talk about sustainable development are now talking about the SDGs, or change in other ways their discourse, but they're not becoming more powerful. So you would find an environmental ministry that used to talk about environmental protection, or used to talk about sustainable development. Now it's talking about the SDGs. So it looks like more SDGs, the SDGs have an effect, but actually there's not an empowerment of those who use the terminology. So it's kind of not necessarily a change in politics, it's just a change in discourses without any meaningful improvement towards sustainability. And then there's some broader question that we're analyzing in our team. One is, this is not new to those of you who are engaged in these issues, is the challenge of selectivity. And that means, do we find evidence, and we surely find evidence, that some SDGs are maybe some more effective than others, and that actors have the right and the possibility to pick SDGs. Not necessarily governments, I mean, they are supposed to report on all the SDGs, but like industry, for example, is very easy to kind of report on some SDGs and then claim to implement all of them together. So there is this danger of this process of SDG picking. One question we have, and this comes up in our research quite often now, is the question of diversion. To what extent has this process of goal setting and then target setting and then indicator setting shaped the definition and the implementation of sustainable development in certain directions that are aligned with existing power relations? That those actors that are powerful, that they manage in a sense to shape the target and indicator setting process in ways that fits to their own interest and their own existing power relations, so that the SDGs are not necessarily easily transformative. And this means that the process of implementation in terms of indicator setting becomes very important. So they have goals with a very, very ambitious and transformative language, but then when you talk about targets and indicators for these targets, then it might be a process where the ambition and the transformative character is slowly going away and existing power relations prevail. And that leads to another point that is not a finding of our work. So I really marked on the slide also quite clearly work in progress. But one question is, to what extent maybe the SDGs are blocking an action space for more progressive and more transformative political agendas. And what I mean is that we have a crisis. There's no doubt. There's a crisis of global poverty. There's a crisis of climate, biodiversity, and many, many others. I mean, this is well known, especially to those of you, I guess, who listen to these talks. But there is a feeling maybe also that people believe action is being taken. You see governments, you see international organizations, you see them all talking about the SDGs, so you get the impression, maybe the illusion of action. Meetings are being held in New York, you have the Hydropolitical Forum, governments are reporting on all what they're doing peer learning, as Marianne has pointed out in the earlier session, but to what extent does it create a show, a circus, an illusion of political action without really being transformative? And by that, it could take out the energy and progressiveness of other alternative agendas. And therefore, one question is not a finding, but one hypothesis that comes up in our research is, to what extent are the SDGs potentially demobilizing more progressive political movements? So it's kind of the smokescreen of action that is maybe there and that might demobilize more progressive alternatives that might be out there in the communities that are fighting for sustainability and change. So this was some of the points that come up in our discussions. As I said, we don't have any clear findings yet. You have to wait a couple of years for that. We have to wait, everybody has to wait. But some outcomes I could imagine is, number one is it's absolutely impossible that we will find zero impacts. I mean, it's not happening. This is not how the world functions. You can't have such a huge thing like the SDGs and global goals without finding anything. So we expect that we find some impact, some steering effects of some SDGs in some countries and some sectors and at some governance levels. Maybe in Barcelona, maybe we find some evidence in the city of Barcelona. We find, I mean, it's quite obvious. I mean, like the city where we are based, Utrecht, it's really a city that is taking the SDGs quite seriously. So we find impacts of the SDGs in the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands. The point is this really changing the global game? Is this really a change to global governance? Is it really a transformation? Is it really the change that we really need in our times, in these times of global crisis in many ways? And then secondly, we might find some inequality effects. So that might be, and this is typical for any political process, and this is typical for any political science analysis, that we might find that the SDGs are benefiting some sectors and regions and governance levels more than others. And there might be winners and losers. And we are trying now in our research to identify who these winners and losers could be. And then what I mentioned, I hinted already in my previous slide, the smoke screen effects, which could be an interesting discussion, especially with scholars of global governance, to what extent these SDGs are a process that is functioning at the global level in a way that it is giving the illusion of transformative progress in a situation where you don't find actually much transformation happening. And then it can block maybe alternatives. And that means that the SDGs might actually legitimize non-action. So countries like Spain, for example, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but any country produces the voluntary national report, sends it to New York, it is in New York in the high political forum, it is being discussed, there's some peer learning, a little bit finger pointing here and there. So there's lots of stuff is happening under the prime ministers, the kings, the presidents, every 4 years they're participating themselves in New York in these meetings. So there is a show is going on. And the point is, does it maybe hide that actually not much change is happening on many of these indicators? These are some of the questions. And what we also do is, and this is my last slide now, the last slides, we are all looking forward to 2022, which is the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference and the 30th anniversary of the first Rio Conference in '92. It's not clear what the Swedish government, whether there will be a big Stockholm plus 50 event in Stockholm. Something will probably happening around the world also on these issues. So we believe this is also an important moment to revisit the SDGs. And for that reason, we have brought together a team of 60+ authors with a steering group that you see here on our Zoom call. It was all done under Corona conditions. Cambridge University Press has offered to publish our findings in March 2022. It will be out. So we have brought together 60 people who are all experts on the SDGs in a variety of fields. Marianne, who has spoken earlier, she's part of the steering committee, is also leading one of the chapters. But we have many other colleagues who are working on these issues from all over the globe. And we are trying to bring together this team and review all the literature that we can find based on a very systematic literature, meta-analysis on the impact that the SDGs had so far. And this we bring out, and it will be published in March 2022, 7 years after the SDGs have been negotiated and agreed upon, but also quite some time before they have to be achieved. So it's exactly midterm, and we hope that this book and this assessment process can help to maybe change course and lead to a really progression into the direction of sustainability by 2030. And we also look forward still to engagement, not as co-authors, the process is closed as such, but as reviewers, as advisors. And if you have any paper that you believe that we have to read and should consult in our review, please send it on. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope I was not running out of time. And I thank you so much. Good. I lead over to the chair, Oriol.
Thank you very much for such a fascinating presentation. Now we give the floor to Anne Ellersiek. Okay, go ahead.
So, thank you again for the invitation, Oriol, and thanks for the great presentation before, Frank. So I want to talk a bit more probably more from a practitioner's perspective. So first, a brief background about how I got to the SDGs or looking at the SDGs. So I started actually during my PhD work, I looked at one of the key, or what was lauded to be one of the key instruments for implementing the SDGs. That is partnerships. So by partnerships, we understood different to the global partnership that is manifested or defined by SDG 17. Partnerships at the local level, implementing partnerships, as Benedict called it in the panel before. And then back then we looked into those instruments or the organizational networks that were called partnerships at that time. Those were partnerships that were working in public services. So I looked specifically at partnerships in the energy and water sector. In ACP countries that were funded by the 9th EDF at that time and under the global agenda of the MDGs back then. So then we focused on the internal governance factors or internal factors that made the partnerships effective or not, and less so on the surrounding, the environment or the institutional embedding of partnerships. And then by the adoption of the SDGs in 2015, then in 2016 and 17, parallel to the adoption of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, we took a look at, together with Marianne Beisheim and colleagues from the Sonderforschungsbereich, we took a look at partnerships, how they're embedded in, for instance, national implementation schemes and plans. And so there, to give one example, we looked at partnerships working again in the water sector in Kenya, and we found that there was weak and very fragmented meta-governance for such partnerships. So to give you a precise example is, for instance, Benedict talked about it with public-private partnerships that had been around much longer. Also in Kenya, and they had for instance, a focal point that was registering those partnerships and also the stakeholders involved in those partnerships, and that was giving an orientation for the operations of those partnerships. This wasn't the case really for the partnerships that we looked at. So for instance, some of them sought to provide water services in the slums around Nairobi. So and there we found that there was neither a point of registration for those partnerships, and there wasn't also not much at national level orientation given to those partnerships, so on which topics and in which areas they should focus on. And the same occurs for the reporting mechanisms. So there wasn't much embeddedness of partnerships operations in those national development plans and frameworks. So what we did then is to derive some more general lessons learned from the look at the meta-governance provided in the national framework of Kenya. And what we then basically derived from that, from those specific cases, was that there needs to be a better integration, what Frank said at one of the last slides of his presentation, so the challenge of integration and interlinkages. So we talked also to respondents that were then arguing that the better those partnerships are involved and integrated in local plannings at national level, but in the Kenyan case also at subnational level, what was of major importance, what we found in the respondents' answers, was that the thematic areas had to basically fit into this national planning and also subnational planning in order to become effective, and also to even be able to talk about effectiveness of partnerships, because there were no reporting schemes in place. So no one actually knew whether those partnerships were effective at the local level. From the research, there were some strategic ideas by respondents how this could happen. And then basically what we said is that there must be a bit more of this integration also with those parties involved in the partnerships. And then back to the question of the panel. So what do these findings based on those case studies on those instruments of partnerships tell us about the potential of the SDGs as a global agenda? We would say that we know something about the success factors for partnerships. So one of them people who studied these partnerships might know the paper by, for instance, Patbeck and Weideberg. They were establishing a typology of success factors for partnerships. So this is what we know. We know we had a look inside of those instruments, but we know less about the interaction between, for instance, the governance, the internal governance of partnerships, and how this interacts in the effectiveness of partnerships with national frameworks and meta-governance structures. So what can we say about the potential? When we look back at the Kenyan case, Marianne said this at during the first panel. She said that the VNRs, for instance, so the voluntary national reviews of countries to the HLPF, these initiatives are taking up, and countries do submit their VNRs. So when we look at for instance, the Kenyan VNR from 2020, they state that they open up participation in their interagency technical committee to non-state actors, so to a broad range of civil society actors, including businesses, including NGOs, local community organizations, etc. They also claim that they established a parliamentary caucuses on the SDG implementation, so involving parliamentarians. They also claim that they have a new SDG coordination group for local governors and at a country level, and they established an overarching multi-stakeholder framework for SDG implementation, so proactively approaching civil society and further stakeholders to get engaged in the implementation of the SDGs. So these seem pretty good examples and progress made. Taken the Kenyan case, but more to the general question is what is now, based on these examples and also on what countries, for instance, report in their VNRs, to be said about the potential of, for instance, partnerships to contribute to SDG implementation, and then back to the question whether the SDGs make a difference, for instance, in comparison to the MDGs before. So from my perspective, like based on those empirical examples, I would say that the SDGs made a difference. For instance, right now, actually, I'm working for the science platform in Germany, and there we see that there is a lot of discussion going on also regarding governance issues and criteria on processes, how the SDGs are implemented, and also how national sustainable development strategies are developed and implemented by a broad range of stakeholders. And so I think partnerships and all multi-stakeholder fora do make a difference and are quite differently organized in comparison to the MDGs. And the last point is that I would see a difference in the way that developed countries, so that's not developing or developmental agenda anymore, but developed countries are engaged in those discussions as well. And especially in Germany, this discussion is quite extensive. Then we come to the most critical question that Frank raised already in the last part of his presentation: is what is the net effect of the SDGs? So on this, I think it would be great to put this question into the discussion. So from my perspective, I would say that this difference to the MDGs in terms of, like, it's not a purely developmental agenda, but it's also to probably the same extent or even more involving or getting engaged stakeholders in developed countries. So this, I think, is a difference that would have to be empirically tested or proven. But another thing that then for the potential of the SDGs would be to look at the challenges that we defined before. So the first one is integration and interlinkages. So can a global agenda such as the SDGs really become truly a local agenda that is locally owned by different stakeholders? So partnerships are an important means to ensure that. But so far we can say that one of the most interesting parts of the SDG agenda for such stakeholder engagement would be the identification, but also maybe finding a solution due to partnerships and also dialogue for the conflicts in interests. So one of the, to my view, most important part of the SDGs is that it explicitly addresses the conflicts in interests. So for the SDGs to become really a truly transformative agenda, I think this is the focus of partnerships, but also stakeholder engagement in general in implementing the SDGs, is to address those conflicts of interest. So that would be my final point. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for your discipline in the management of time. And now we turn to our last panelist, who is Louise Moyleman. Your turn.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the opportunity also. My name is Louis Meuleman. I'm not a full-time academic. I'm what can be called a pracademic, a practitioner who also does some academic work. But my main career has been working in the public sector at several levels the last 10 years in the European Commission. And I was one of the people who wrote texts, the texts that are then analyzed by political scientists. Which is, by the way, a method I would not really encourage, because the texts don't always have the truth in them. But that's another issue. When I, let me see how I have to do this, like this. Yeah. My first slide is always about the context. In all we do, in all we analyze, we research, the context matters a lot. So we live in very turbulent times. There's an increasing inequality and poverty. The climate and biodiversity crisis and the pandemic are destroying lots of systems. This affects also the implementation of, but it's different in different countries. And what we also have seen already is that COVID-19 again illustrates that well-governed countries are coping better with the pandemic and with other crises. And this is not just the rich countries, are also less developed countries who are performing very well, like Costa Rica, which is, by the way, a country which is also performing very well on the SDGs. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, I have to go back to this one. Yeah. I cannot just handle the slides in the normal way. So many public institutions and their governments are not able to cope with the challenges of our times. And one of the big reasons behind that is that for decades we have had economic policies that have resulted in small and weak governments and their agencies, because the invisible hand of the market would solve all the problems. And that is an issue that is now meanwhile really recognized everywhere, and very much also at the UN level, where I'm also advising. This means that at all levels, including at the global level, a lot of things need to change, and I would like to mention 4 tracks or 4 priorities of change. And the first is about public administration and governance as a strategic policy area. The second is about reform priorities. The third about governance of governance, or meta-governance, and the fourth about addressing the silo mentality. Well, on the first one, making public administration and governance a strategic policy area, we know that SDGs 16 and 17 are the enabling goals, the governing goals, and all other SDGs have specific targets on means of implementation. But what you see in reality, and very much also in my practice at the European Commission, is that the political priorities at all levels tend to focus on the what, on the policy, and much less on the how, on the quality of public administration and governance. And that's a mismatch. And that's a predictor of failure, on governance failure, on top of policy failure. And this is something the global community can hardly afford. This means, in my view, that departments responsible for the quality of public administration and governance, for example, Ministry of the Interior, they should have a place in the SDG boardroom or cockpit or central coordination committee within a government. And it's often not the case. They are often not involved because public administration and governance quality is considered as an overhead issue. It's not a political priority. The second thing is, make them leading also on mechanisms for policy coherence and multi-level governance. These people could do that and should coordinate that. Globally, you see that there is across the UN bodies quite a good common united view on the priority of the SDGs, but I've never seen an organization which is so siloed as the United Nations. So the second thing that where there is a big need for change is about public sector reform. Public administration reform has for a long time in most countries, and also promoted by the World Bank, for example, has had a concentration on efficiency measures, and effectiveness was lost, was not there. And I suppose everybody of you has examples from your own country where the efficiency of school systems or health systems had become more important than the effectiveness. The response of governments to the pandemic has showed the power and the importance of the state in the crisis. So it's a kind of a recovery of the state, and also the failure to act accordingly by many governments. And the correct response to the pandemic is to demand better government, not less government. At the global level, I'm coming back to the global level on each slide, governance is one of the 4 levers of sustainability transformation of the Global Sustainable Development Report 2019. And at the global level, it is recognized that governance is important, maybe because the United Nations as such is a governance structure. This idea that you should not focus on efficiency only, but have a broader mission is very much promoted also by the economist Mariana Mazzucato. She promotes the return of the state and says that we should have mission-oriented reform, and the mission should be, of course, achieving the SDGs. And so innovative governance must be embedded, in my view, in mission-oriented public administration and governance reform. And that means, for example, that all great transformation areas, be it mobility, energy, or others, or food, you need bold and inspirational mission involvement of business and civil society. And that helps focusing more on the ends than on the means. It's not, I mean, you could say something critical about that too, but this is a good move compared to where we are now. Global public administration and governance quality has reasonable attention from the UN ECOSOC, the countries in that important committee of the UN, and UN bodies have a similar SDG mission, but again, still working in silos usually. Then to work towards a mission, you also have to work with principles, and the central part of mission-oriented reform should be creating the capacities for innovative governance, using the 11 principles of effective governance, which were designed by the committee I'm a member of, and also by the UNDESA and accepted, endorsed by the ECOSOC Council, so by the UN member states. And the importance of these 11 principles for effective governance of sustainable development is, I think, mainly in the third part, the 5 inclusiveness criteria. It was just mentioned already that the inclusiveness, that implementation of the SDG risks creating unequal situations. And when you look at other principles of effective governance from OECD or the World Bank, these inclusiveness principles are usually not really there. So this is an important thing. Then it's important to work, of course, on digitalization of government, access, open government data, simplifying processes, decentralizing public services, and making partnerships with private sector and civil society. We've heard a lot about that. There's also much more about to say, for example, that partnerships need a certain level of trust, and that's different in countries with a low trust culture than in a high trust culture. Good. The third priority would be to apply meta-governance to prevent failure and to design with context. Innovative governance requires new leadership and new instruments, but in the first place, a vision on governance. And what we see is that in most countries, the common public governance style at all levels of government is still hierarchy. it is centralist, it is legalist. There are differences. In Germany, the style is hierarchy, but it is legalist. And in France, it is hierarchy, but it is centralist. Every decision is good as long as it's made in Paris, for example. And it has this very strong silo mentality. It's not inclusive, it's not geared to partnerships and to co-production. The most needed innovation, therefore, is shifting the balance between the institutions and the tools and the mindsets of hierarchical network and market governance styles. So it's not just about replacing hierarchy, because hierarchy will always be important. It is a very useful way to approach societal problems, but a contextualized mix of styles works best. And meta-governance is that approach. It's a method, it's combining features of three classical governance styles into dynamic situational combinations. And with different value packages. I can only show on this slide how wide the concept is. In my last book, I identified 50 differences between the three governance styles, hierarchy, market, and network. And for each of these 50 topics or themes or features or shapes of governance, there are different expressions in practice for each of these dimensions. It is an approach that is based on practice. The European Commission creates policy packages that should work in all the countries with all the different cultures. And that means that should be a little bit, there should be a legal part, but there should be also an incentives part, and there should be a part on collaboration, for example. It can be done at all levels, by all public managers, line manager, project manager, but it requires something that not everybody has yet, and that has to be trained. Thinking beyond existing traditions of governance, thinking beyond your own preference, because governance styles are normative, they are value-based, and everybody has its own values. So you have everybody has the preference. As a Dutchman, I'm a Dutchman, I have a preference deep down for network governance. And I had trouble learning and to understand hierarchy. It's not a new governance style, but it's a kind of a management approach, you could say, to tackle governance failure, to prevent that. And it's also about using this full toolbox with 50 features. One example in practice, because I saw that in the next webinar, the C-level governance plays a role. You can also see here that you can distinguish three different ways of doing multi-level governance. The top-down approach, which takes years in the European level, set to up to 7 years before a European proposal gets to the local level. The third approach, the subsidiarity approach, where you have to do things at the lowest level where it's possible, takes years for you can scale up good local ideas to a higher level. And what is missing for urgent and important problems is, in my view, is the middle version, real-time, collaborative, multi-level governance. It's just an idea that you can, if you analyze a governance problem and you miss something or something is wrong, it's often the case that one of the three styles is or too dominant or completely missing. The fourth and last point is about silo mentality and about changing mindsets. Working in political and institutional and mental silos, because there are three types of silos, is a main cause of ineffective governance for the SDGs. And silos are also good. They're not just bad. They give structure, they help responsibility and transparency and accountability, and they give identity. It's good to be in a cozy group with silo people who think in the same way. But instead of breaking down all the silos, which has been a mantra, we should, another alternative is teach silos to dance, make them work together, and more flexible and more permeable without losing the necessary structure. And that requires very good communication and collaboration skills, but that can be learned. The mutual gains approach is a famous approach which really would help here. And there are also other concepts, bureaucracy hackers and boundary spanners, terms invented for people who work in the hierarchy, who work in the government, and know all the rules, but also know where the cracks in the system are and how you can use the rules to create change that was not meant to happen, but is necessary. Then, okay, I get already. Sorry, no, I forgot this slide. So the system is not still working so well for me. Again, here a meta-governance approach example that in the 3 different governance styles, there are 3 different views on how important or for what silos are. And in a hierarchical thinking, silos are good and you need them to keep them for structure. In market governance approach, silos are just not real efficient and you have to break them down, get rid of them. And in the network governance thinking, this is this teaching silos to dance approach. The UN UNEP has made a self-assessment tool on policy coherence for to unite silos and policy coherence for sustainable development. Last year, this is very recommendable material, but there's no time to get into that. I would like to end with 2 key messages, which work at all levels, I think. The first, public administration and governance reform focusing on efficiency instead of effectiveness destroys the capacity of governments to lead on implementing the SDGs. I think that's really important to also reflect what this means. Secondly, we need to move away from the efficiency paradigm towards making public administration and governance strategic policy, starting SDG targeted mission-oriented reform, apply contextualized governance of governance or meta-governance, and address silo mentality. Many of the things here are also included in UN's CEPAs, the Committee of Experts on Public Administration, inputs for this year's high-level political forum, and it will be online very soon, but you will find similar recommendations there. And that's about it. I had a nice counter here, I forgot to start it, so I don't know exactly, but I suppose my time is up. I said something about the why, the what, and spend a bit more time on the how. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to the 3 of you. We could now start with the Q&A section, and that would imply both reactions from panelists to each other's presentations, whether you have questions or not to your fellow presenters, and people from the audience attendees to this webinar. If you have any question or any comment that you would like to raise, there's this little button with raising hand sign at the bottom of the screen that you can use, and then we can give you the floor. I do have a question that I would like to throw at any of you. Actually, I don't mind. Which would be about like the theory of the case, right? So, like, what would be the path of success for SDGs? If SDGs have to have any effectiveness, what would that effectiveness be based on, right? What would be the gears or the mechanisms that should be moving to lead SDGs towards a successful outcome? What's the theory of the case here? What would be from if you and depending on your own background, perhaps some answers will be more analytical or abstract, and some more like grounded or down to earth, if you wish, or empirical, right? But what should be happening, and can we detect any of those mechanisms already moving ahead or not? There's another question. Perhaps we can gather a number of them, and then you can address them in packages, so to speak. Marianne, who has also talked in the panel before, has a question.
Right, thank you. Just as an icebreaker, maybe also, I mean, the session is about instruments, and I was wondering, Louis was saying it's it's about the how, and I very much agree. We know the goals, right? And we have the targets. We have even indicators to measure our progress, but we don't really know, and member states don't really agree on the how to get there. But I was wondering, I mean, Louis was saying it's not so much about the policies, but I think we also don't have the policies. We don't have those ideas about transformative policies, right? I skipped earlier the slide on the Global Sustainable Development Report that makes this point, how to produce real transformation with multiple levers. So I think we are lacking ideas how to get there. And I was wondering whether you have basically it's the same question like Oriol's, right? Where's the big lever that we need to move? Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other hand being raised. Let me also say that if you don't want to talk, or you don't have a microphone, or you are, I don't know, in a library and cannot speak, and you prefer to submit your questions through the chat, you can also do that, and then I will read them out loud. So who wants to start? Frank, go ahead. You raise your hand.
I just show myself in here because I was the first to present, so maybe I'm the first to respond. I mean, fantastic presentations. I enjoyed them very much, and the question of Marianne was, of course, spot on. And there's so much to be said. I mean, especially to your question, Oriol, about what are the mechanisms that are really possible. I mean, as a political scientist, of course, the answer would be it depends. I mean, for all the 17 SDGs and 169 targets, it's not one singular policy that is there. I mean, looking at Louis' presentation, it's all of them. And it's kind of this triangle that he presented. I fully agree with his point that the last 20 years of destroying the public administrative services and system in our countries, especially in all countries, nothing especially in all countries, it was a mistake. I mean, this entire neoliberal onslaught on our public administrations was not sufficient. We have to rebuild it back. We have to rebuild state capacity. Another one is cooperation, for example. I mean, many of these SDGs countries cannot implement themselves. It's just, I mean, especially poor countries, vulnerable countries, least developed countries, they need international cooperation to achieve it. Or even industrialized countries in many ways use technological cooperation. These missions that have been defined requires totally new ways and new degrees and levels of international cooperation. That's very, very important, to name just one. And change of behavior also to changes of market. I mean, the free market is just not able in a way to change sufficiently the behavior of people on these matters. Just to have advertisement and information and encouragement, that doesn't help. You need to have clear, strong policies. And taking up Marianne, who I can't see in the system, unfortunately, but I know she's there. I think we have the policies, and we are just not implemented. So I could name quite interesting policies that can change the world in many ways. I mean, like a strong taxation regime on carbon, the carbon tax. I mean, really a higher price for carbon will definitely help us to decarbonize our economies at the global level. Or to name another one, just out of the head, I mean, one of the many, 77% of the land that we can use is used for the production of livestock, including for dairy. So why not having stronger policies that reduce the pressure on this land to free it up for ecosystems, to free it up also for other activities that are maybe important, production of food. So there's so many ways of how we can potentially reduce the consumption of meat. And this is not the way of just talking about it. It means public policies, and they're all available. It's just nobody's really doing it. But it's all there. But I think very important to pick up Louis' point is the strengthening of meta governance, the breaking out of silos, the strengthening of public administration. And I think there are lots of ways of bringing this forward. I think our institutions are not in the best shape, and we have to be much stronger in this direction. I could talk much more about it. Leave it to others.
Good. Louis, you have raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. I think all of us could speak for 3 hours about these issues, because this, and now we're getting passionate also, because this is so important. but there is no, yeah, there is no recipe. But I would like to reiterate the 4 levers in the Global Sustainable Development Report 2019. The first is governance, and the second is economy and finance. The third is activation of actors, and the fourth is science and technology. And these are important levers for change. It's not enough, and it has to be together. But it's important to look at that. And on the governance level, policy coherence for sustainable development is important. But it's not just should not be text only. It has to happen. It's a process. It's yeah. And so the 4 levels are important. Second thing I would like to promote still is that these change processes have to be done in a way that it reflects the diversity of our cultures and our traditions and our histories in the different countries. I mean, the whole concept of best practice and people still using it is complete nonsense. There are almost no best practices. There are good practices, but you have to translate them to a local situation. So a principle for me could be that you have to, if you want to change the implementation of the SDGs, then you should do it in a way that is as much different from what the cultures and the values and the traditions in the country that were the drivers of unsustainable behavior. So as much different from that, but as much compatible as necessary with the old cultures and the traditions to get people moving, to motivate people to move, and without having them to deny their own values. That would be terrible. We have long experience of export of our values to other countries, and it's just usually destruction of lots of things. That's what I wanted to add.
And Ellersiek, do you have anything else to add? I mean, many things have been said, so then.
I might add, or I want to add a positive example, not a best practice, Louis, but
yes.
just to give one. So because both of your questions, Marianne's as well as yours, Oriol's, are targeting the question of theory of change behind it. What is the transformative character of those instruments that we're employing now for the SDGs? Partly have done so already for previous global agendas. So, and actually, like what we just said, we have to get out the most in terms of transformative impact without changing or without imposing values. No, values of cooperation is one important topic, and this works mostly both sides, or out of my more experience from practice. So I give you an example. I'm now organizing a dialogue between scientists or scientific councils in Germany, and there we had, during one of the dialogues, we had this reflection on the dialogue, basically by the participants saying, like, they really find this interesting, this dialogue, interdisciplinary not only, but also inter-policy fields, right? So it's not only giving advice to one specific ministry, but it's more like discussing overarching issues that are provided for by the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, and there, after a long discussion on, like, is there a necessity for such kind of advice? That was the question in the first place. Some councils were arguing, or some scientists were arguing, there is no such necessity. Then the question, is there a demand for it? So we have many of those dialogue formats and fora and ways of cooperating or collaborating for the SDGs, what implies like a specific transformative character of those dialogues and forums. But the question is whether this is then also matched, like there is no use for having interdisciplinary policy advice, for instance, provided by such a dialogue, if there's not a recipient structure on behalf of the administration, but also on behalf of Parliament, right? So, and then they popped the question back and said, like, okay, now we engage in such a discourse and such a dialogue, but what are the structures that could actually receive and turn this into practice? Like the advice that we would provide then due to such a format. And I think those are then interesting, at least not best practices, but good examples where impulses can be given into an environment such as like the science policy interface in this case. And then like if you build a new product, so this is inter-council advice within the framework of the SDGs, and then there needs to be a recipient structure within the administration. So those are impulses that can go a bit further, and at least those are, like, I wouldn't say or use the term pockets of good practice or best practice, but those are impulses at least that are really due to the framework of the SDGs, because otherwise there are not too many frameworks that those people meet and discuss those issues. So, and then what I raised in the presentation as well as the next interesting step would be then to really find formats where you can discuss conflicts of interest, not only synergies, not only where we can complement each other, but also get to the hard issues and discuss those conflicts.
Good. There is a question from the audience. I am afraid I will for sure mispronounce the name. Chebi or
yeah, it's Sebi or Simon.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah, thank you all for your presentations. It was a question to do a little with sort of Frank's point on system conservatism and to do with inclusiveness, and whether the SDGs block action space for more progressive and transformative political agenda. So, for example, alternative economic systems like degrowth or enhancing inclusiveness, because the goals are framed in quite anthropocentric terms, you know, intergenerational justice, but, you know, more progressive could be interspecies justice. Yeah, do you have suggestions for how this question can be assessed and remedied?
So it's a big one.
Great point. I mean, from Sebi, thanks so much. I mean, as I said, I mean, that's what we are not fully clear with our findings. So this is kind of more like a hypothesis that we are working on. This extent, to what extent more progressive ideas can be crowded out by the SDGs. But just to take up your example of degrowth, I mean, of course, the SDGs explicitly request, which is one of the SDGs, is economic growth. It's part of the SDGs. It's kind of this 8.1, I think it's kind of, it's really clearly written there. One of the SDGs is we are committing to economic growth, and for these developed countries with specific quantitative goal. On the other hand, they're saying, like SDG 13 is about climate policy, and this question has been raised. To what extent is this really all coherent? To what extent can you have economic growth and at the same time achieve the full carbon neutrality that we need to have in a very short period of time? And this is one of the questions. And the point that we want to raise is, and this may be playing into service, to what extent are these more progressive agendas of degrowth, for example, of degrowth, or it is very strong in Barcelona, of course, as we all know. So to what extent are these progressive agendas being not only not supported, but maybe even blocked out by the impression SDGs are fantastic, everything's great. So that's kind of one thing that we are discussing. So that to what extent are people who might be progressive or might be in for transformative change or might take a lot of action, to what extent are they not taking these extra steps in terms of lobbying for the growth, as maybe some people might want to do in Spain and other places, because the SDGs are there. Because I think the SDGs are there, we are supporting the SDGs without realizing that the SDGs have explicitly a pro-growth target. The SDG framework. So this makes the SDGs very, very complicated. And then also this point, interspecies, this is a term that you probably won't get from the UN system for at least 10, 20 years. There's a great debate about it. I think it's very important to think along these lines. But the United Nations as an intergovernmental body with 193 countries on board, I think we have to wait a long, long time. But that's again a point also for people to discuss to what extent those who are supporting ideas of interspecies justice, to what extent do they realize that the SDGs actually don't do anything about interspecies justice. Maybe you put it under the environment, the ecosystem targets in the end, but it's not explicitly there. So to what extent is this an agenda that blocks out these more, let's say, more transformative ideas, even though I think they're also very, very complicated. And at one point, I mean, I just also on I like this very much her reference to Germany, which is actually a case where I think there is quite a big impact of the SDGs. One of the few countries where there is change in terms of this platform that I works on and other things. But on the other hand, it's also a question of what is Germany really changing? Like Germany has an energy policy, no one has a climate policy, but is it done because of SDG 13? As Germany is doing lots of stuff in whatever, like all interior policies, has anybody in Germany done anything in public policy because of SDG 16? Is there anything that any German minister is looking at SDG 16 and says, oh, this is a long list and we have now to do something about it? Or SDG 1 or SDG 2? Is anybody in Germany, in the political system, but also at any level, doing anything differently because there's SDG 1? So that's kind of the question. So there are councils, there are committees, platforms, and ministries. We have done actually an analysis of press announcements of German ministries. That's where it comes from, actually. You have to analyze all the press announcements of the German ministries and want to see to what extent they're more aligning with the SDGs. And this is the change I mentioned actually in my presentation, where the Environment Ministry, for example, that used to be talking about sustainability, now talks about SDGs. So you can say there is a change. SDGs are more visible, but the point is it really a change in an empowerment of the ministry, as opposed to the Environment Ministry or to the coal lobby or whatever it is, the car lobby in Germany. So these are some of the questions where you see change, but is it really significant change? It's kind of a really game changer. And maybe then the cost is that it blocks out the more progressive agendas that the CEPA. So these are some of the questions you have to answer. And just in terms of, I don't know who raised it, but in terms of the private sector, it's also interesting when you talk about partnerships. It's kind of interesting to see this dialogue, this discourse about partnerships, and we have to be very critical. And so, I mean, when industry starts to talk about partnerships, you should be very concerned and think about it. I mean, so when the car industry starts to say we do the SDGs, what does it actually mean? I mean, to what extent is it really a meaningful change in these actors' space? So, so this entire partnership idea, I like it very much. I've also worked on the 2002 partnerships with Packberg and Wiederberg and others. But we also have to see that there's also a lot of smoke and sometimes not much fire. But I can stop. Sammy, great, was a great question. I can't see your face, but I think that's a good question.
Great. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I would have another one if nobody else has one. So I approach SDGs coming from research on climate multilateralism, right? On climate change, and in that field we have moved from one model of multilateralism, which has to do with this idea of a global deal with multilaterally negotiated, legally binding targets that would be like the Kyoto Protocol, towards this sort of bottom-up, nationally determined contributions, which are assessed in relationship to this common target, which is 1.5/2 Celsius degrees, right? Which seems to be like a move from a more international to a more nationalized, more flexible, from a top-down to more of a bottom-up approach in which states have more leeway to do whatever they want to do. But at the same time, like Paris, the way Paris has moved since 2015 is of course less dragged by the need for consensus, right? Like the norms of what seems acceptable as the level of ambition on climate policies are not dragged by the need for consensus. So we have this sort of multi-speed regime in which norm promoters of all kinds can reach at times the critical mass of states behind their proposals on what should be the next expectations on what should be done on climate change, right? And I think we have seen that in terms of the increasing endorsement in one very nice S-shaped graph, like the ones that theory will tell you that diffusion does, right? Like a norm cascade, an S-shaped graph with the endorsement of carbon neutrality by 2050, right? Which has taken quite a lot of speed in the last couple of years. So it's more flexible and more nationalized, but at the same time, you have less vetoes, and it's more open to normative pressure and peer pressure and pressure from international or internationally minded actors, say the UN Secretary General with the Ambition Summits, or I don't know, Scandinavian teams, or you know, you name it, right? So when I look at SDGs, I sort of identify some of these ideas too, right? Like non-legally binding, broadly consensual but vaguely worded targets that perhaps might have the same effect. I don't know. We don't even know whether Paris will lead us anywhere, right? But now everybody takes it for granted that if Biden doesn't announce carbon neutrality by 2050, he will not be meeting the mark, right? And probably a year ago, that would have not been the expectation, right? So there's this. There was this paper published a few months ago on saying that on climate action we might have been prisoners of the wrong dilemma, right? Is this the case also? So is this a trend? That would be is SDGs and the Paris Agreement and all these, you know, sorts of global compact-like kind of deals, sort of a trend that can promise a less consensus-based, less veto players, more multi-speed kind of global governance games? That was my question. I hope somebody wants to pick it up. Okay, Louis, very brave.
Yeah, well, yeah, indeed. Well, 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, indeed, I think there was too much focus on this globally binding legal agreement, which then didn't work, and in the governance mix, and the rest was not so visible. Now we've switched to the other side, voluntary approaches everywhere, and I think the good thing is that it opens up a lot of initiatives, the softer approach to governance. But what I'm saying is that, and that's why I am promoting this concept of meta-governance, that the hierarchical style, the legal tools should always be part of the mix, and we shouldn't forget that. And for some reason, people like to be digital. It's either this or that, but it should be both, of course, and it should be a right combination, and the balance should be the way that it works in the end, that it delivers results. So this is something we still always need to work on, and in order to understand that, and I comment last thing I would like to say is how to understand this better is also working better together across social sciences, because it's not enough that political scientists are supporting this or looking at this. We need anthropologists and sociologists and organizational psychologists, and even this type of social scientists who call themselves economists could be useful in a team. But that's what we need, and then science can advise better to give the options for decision makers to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Biermann. you also raise your hand.
Well, I mean, very great comments. Also, Louis said that we need economists. I'm not 100% sure what that is anyway, so, but long discussion. Anyway, what you want to raise, of course, it's true. It's this kind of development from more binding to less binding approaches that we pointed out. I disagree sometimes with this terminology of top-down, bottom-up, because it is, I think it is, I mean, it's very widely used. Everybody talks about it, but I think it has a discursive function, it's performative, because nobody wants to have top-down. Everybody wants to have bottom-up. So the way you use, not you, but people using top-down has a function, but kind of downgrading the United Nations or the European Union for that matter. So it's kind of, it's always against the top-down government and international organizations, and in favor of, quite often, in favor of industry. So industry always loves bottom-up, never like top-down. So therefore, I mean, anyway, but I think I very much would argue that we have to have stronger approach. I mean, I was very impressed. I mean, we can learn a lot from Corona, in the sense, what are the possibilities? Nobody would have expected this tremendous degree of action that governments have taken. That's number one. That's kind of, I mean, in a sense, like the Dutch Prime Minister was very unusual in the Netherlands, in the television with this kind of black suit and talking in very serious voice as if we are kind of attacked by aliens in a sense. So this was kind of unprecedented. It was the first time since the 1970s that the Dutch Prime Minister was in that situation in the TV. So that's kind of, governments had to take this over, and most people have accepted it. On the other hand, what we also learn, of course, from, I mean, what I want to say with governments is climate crisis is much bigger than Corona. I mean, I won't talk about this, of course, it's a crisis. We have lots of issues. The big one is climate crisis. If we are not getting this decarbonization done within 10, 20 years, this country, Netherlands, will be gone at some point. So we really have to fix this decarbonization issue. And this is a much bigger crisis than Corona. So what we need to have is these kind of actions to take also on climate crisis. But we also learn from Corona is Corona apartheid. I mean, I've not seen any, I mean, we have a huge vaccination program and we're vaccinating Europeans and Americans. I mean, there's no kind of global solidarity, global sharing on these issues. So we see also to what extent the entire international system doesn't function, and also the SDGs don't function. Because if you would take them seriously, you would have much more sharing of vaccination, vaccines with Africa and with Latin America and with Asian countries. So you see here there's a crisis, and immediately borders are coming up. Vaccines are kind of reserved for the rich countries, down to the 20-year-olds. I mean, so only when every 20-year-old Spaniard that's kind of vaccinated will kind of then more being shared. I mean, I'm a bit exaggerating here. I should not do this, I guess, no, because there is European Union has a sharing program. Of course, we know it, but we also see that there's a huge variation in terms of Corona policy. So generally, I mean, also as for some of the comments from my other in the chat, I mean, I think we should really engage in a debate of a stronger state action on many of these issues, because the crisis is very big.
Good. We are 3 minutes away from our deadline, which means that if there's any other quick comment, we could accommodate it easily. But if there's not, then we might as well call it a day. So thank you very much to everybody who attended this panel, starting with the 3 contributors. I think it was I really enjoyed it. I had a really great time, and I hope you did too, and everybody else attending the webinar. So thank you very much for your time, your attention, and your thoughts. Okay. Bye-bye.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Thank you.
See you. Okay. Bye-bye.